When people doubt that the world can be changed for the better in a short time, I often tell the story of Iceland from my upbringing in the Western Fjords to the modern times. If anybody would have said when I was a kid or a teenager that we would lead the world in terms of clean energy, health, education, equality, openness, democracy, be among the top 5 countries in almost every global league table, everyone would have said that's not possible. But this is what happened.
Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson has really shown during his career, both as a political scientist, as a media personality, as a politician, as a president, that you can do amazing things if you have a clear vision and you're not afraid, even though you will be disputed, because obviously he has been a controversial person in Icelandic politics for a very long time. But with that clear vision and with that courage, he has managed to really make an enormous effort for very important topics. Disarmament during the times of the Cold War, the Arctic and the climate crisis here in the Arctic Circle, which he founded after his presidency. And of course, he also had a tremendous impact on Icelandic society during his time as a politician and the president.
The reason the arc of his career is so unusual is the 2 great issues that confront our planet, the war and peace and the impending climate disaster. He has been at the center of dealing with both of them, effectively, persistently. And this term, you hear it used a lot about persistence. Well, what is persistence? It's not just never giving up, it's being thoughtful and innovative at the same time, which is really a characteristic of his.
He changes very quickly and adapts himself to the situation. Very open to suggestions, very open to outside opinions, but at the end will make up his own opinion. Totally uncorruptible. He really wants to make the world a better place.
You experience one of the extraordinary human beings alive, one of those forces of nature that has boundless energy and optimism and just determination to be a positive force and bring people together.
President Grímsson has been on the political scene in Iceland for well over half a century, and for 20 years as the President of Iceland. That will be his lasting legacy. He, as all the presidents, shaped that office within the confines of the Constitution, the will and desires of the people, and also his own determination and drive.
I think I can state, with my scant knowledge of Icelandic history, that he's the greatest political gladiator that has come out of Icelandic politics ever, from the beginning of Icelandic time. And who else would have been able to change himself from being a leader of a tiny nation somewhere out in the Atlantic and become a global leader in a new and emerging field of climate change and the Arctic matters.
What's unique for me about him as a politician is we're all accused of talking more than doing. He's really a doer. He's somebody who gets things done. And that's very, very hard to do in today's day and age. And the reason he does that is because he's not dogmatic about his position. He's able to say, let me see what's this perspective saying, what is that perspective saying, and find a common ground.
Ólafur, he has as many policy achievements and his achievements in promoting Iceland, but I think what we can really learn from his example and the story of his life is how really anyone from around the world can make a major contribution coming from a small city, from a small country. Iceland is a small country, and it's here in the Arctic. And Ólafur within Iceland actually comes from one of the smaller cities in Iceland. I think it probably has a few hundred people, if even that many. And his story is one of really showing a willpower to contribute, a willpower to make a difference.
Well, Þingeyri was and still is a very small village in the western fjords of Iceland. And when I was a kid, it was very isolated. All the roads to the next fjords closed down because of snow in early October and were not opened again until June. So the only way to have connection to the outside world was once or twice a month when the coastal ship that sailed around Iceland stopped in Þingeyri. And I was sent to this small village to my grandparents when I was 3 years old from Ísafjörður, where I was born, which is also a town in the Western Fjords, because my mother had tuberculosis, which was a very serious pandemic at that time. It killed a lot of people in Iceland. So she stayed away in tuberculosis hospitals for years and years and years.
Perhaps he was molded by the fact that from early on he had to tackle very long odds in his life. I mean, he was an only child. He had an elderly father, and his much younger mother, she was always away in hospitals in far distant corners of the country. So he really never had the motherly care that young kids strive for. This must have put his marks on him.
I was very fortunate to grow up in this small, tiny village where every kid had a sense of the struggle of how the fish caught by the boats was crucial to the survival of the village, how the fate of everyone who lived in the village was known by everybody else. And gradually the characters from the village became a part of my heritage, part of what I am. And sometimes when I was president and met in various gatherings in different parts of the world, leaders of other countries, they reminded me of the people in the village. And I kind of played this in my mind, this kind of game. How would, and I named the different people in the village when I was a kid, react to this statement by this president, world leaders, and so on. So I have often said that you cannot really explain what I became and who I am without bringing this tiny little Icelandic village, Þingeyri in the Western Fjord, into the analysis.
Part of his complexity is the way he appears as a very strong guy. He has a tough guy image, and I have seen him raging like a thunderstorm at Parliament and even bringing it from the brink of disaster. And I have seen him at least twice in the State Council dress down a prime minister and her finance minister in an ice-cold manner so that you almost saw the icicles form on the wall. But I've also been with him in his weakest moments, and I have heard his voice break in a phone call very late at night during the banking collapse. And of course I saw him cry when his late first wife died from leukemia. And he really has an emotional side, and even today, you can't really mention his first wife's name in his presence without his eyes becoming moist and even welling up. So he really is a tough fighter, but he has a very emotional side as well.
He is a good friend. I remember once he called me and I had lost the election. And I was no longer the Premier of Greenland at that time. So I told him, you cannot invite me officially because I'm not the Premier anymore. Then he replied, who cares? You are my guest and you stay in the President's guest house. So that is something which I value a lot, that our friendship goes beyond politics.
He is a difficult friend. He is quite he's strongly opinionated, but it doesn't really mean that he's a besserwisser. He listens to your arguments. One story, he recently published 2 books, and I read the proofs of both. And I had a long list of propositions and comments, and it was very difficult to get it to him because he wanted to debate it. And for the first book, we sat and we debated my comments for 5 hours. And I was absolutely exhausted when it was over. But when the book finally came out in print, I realized that he had taken almost all of my comments into consideration. So despite what some people think, he's a good listener. And he's very good at seeing the core of things.
Being born in Jerusalem, in a strange way, it was not dissimilar to Iceland at the time. Very small, everybody knew each other. And whilst it wasn't safe, I mean, obviously I was surrounded by bombs and wars all the time. It was kids would walk out in the street on their own. Nobody would bother you. And I think that does instill a certain, perhaps false sense of confidence, which both Ólafur has and I have.
To influence the world was a very distant notion if you were a kid in the Western Fjords 5 years ago. Because there were only a few telephones in the village. There was only one radio station in the country. So the big thing was to get to the next village and to the next town. And perhaps occasionally in the summer, take the seaplane to other places. But I said I was born in Ísafjörður. My parents lived there, although my mother spent most of her years when I was a kid in tuberculosis hospital. But my father was one of the leaders in the town council, representing the Social Democrats who basically ran Ísafjörður for decades and built it up into what it became later. And he had a great sense of public service. He had a great sense that you have to help other people to make a success with their lives. So this notion of public service, and also with it the possibility of becoming a leader within the framework of a public service, not as a grandiose scheme for yourself, but in order to serve the community and perhaps ultimately serve the nation, was something that my father gave me, and also what Ísafjörður as a town and his leadership and the other people who led the town with him made a part of the heritage that I linked to Þingeyri.
He is extremely father-like. His qualities are very father-like. He's somebody who I've seen, he meets a young person doing something interesting. He instantly engages with them, encourages them, finds a solution to help them, regardless of what they're doing. And that quality is very rare, and I think that quality keeps him young at 80, and it also allows him to have his ears to the ground. But it also inspires people in a way that is very, very unique and very unusual, because it's very rare that you find a mentor who you don't know. And I've seen him being a mentor to people who he's met for the first time.
I think Ólafur is this inspiration, not only because he's from a small town in a small country, but also he's older. We're celebrating his 80th birthday right now, and he's still pushing on the front lines. He's still encouraging people to make a difference. He is an entrepreneur for positive change in the world, and he could very well be retired, and we would all respect that. And he's officially retired, but he is every day out there trying to make a difference.
When I moved to Reykjavik at the age of 10, Reykjavik was then still a very poor city, by the way. It didn't have geothermal heating. It was still coal and oil were the primary heating resources. There were primarily mud streets, sort of, in Reykjavik. It felt a very strange place, and I was quite unhappy here. So for the first year, I spent most of my time in the city library. And during the first winter, I think I read every book in the children's section. And the nice old ladies who guarded the library started giving me books that were from the section of the library intended for grown-up people. So the world of books, which of course had been a part of my upbringing in the Western Fjords, but then you have to realize you didn't get very many new books when you were in Þingeyri every year. Perhaps 3 or 4, not more. But in Reykjavik, all this big library opened up to me. So I entered the world of books. And I think since then I have, to some extent, always lived in the world of books, which gradually expanded to other countries and other cultures and other civilizations.
A lot of people, including me, feel that Ólafur Ragnar is a kind of an enigma. He is a very complex character. A lot of the general public in Iceland, they consider him to be a serious, stern politician. I remember when I wrote a book about Icelandic politics, and I, in an aside, said that he loved funny stories. People felt this was strange. And I even experienced strangers coming up to me in the street and ask me, does he really have a funny side? Does he really have humor? And I can tell you, he is just like so many, probably anybody else. He likes to let his hair down, likes to laugh in a secure condition, you know. And actually, he himself is a very good storyteller. And he even has the ability to mimic, especially one former PM that I'm not going to name. But when he does it, people like me at least roll in the aisles of laughter. So he's really an enjoyable company, and he likes to laugh, and he is very funny.
Actually, I met him first in the United Kingdom, and we were in the process of talking about how to set up a mechanism to go out and meet all these world leaders, and that was my first interaction with him. And as everyone has said, he's a man, focused, dedicated, and thoughtful, but not terribly serious in the sense that he can on occasion make fun of himself and understand that not everything is serious.
Gradually, during my time in Reykjavik, I started interacting with teenagers from other families. I became closer to the political scene in the country. I quite often went to the Parliament House and up to the gallery and listened to the debates. And then the Parliament House was completely open, so anybody could enter up into the gallery, even a teenager or a kid. And then somehow, when I came to decide what to study at university, the only way to find out beyond what was then taught at the University of Iceland, which was a very limited selection, was to go to the British Embassy. And there were huge books that were description of courses given in English and British universities. And I spent days in the British Embassy looking at these prospectus and curriculum from different universities, and somehow found that in the University of Manchester, I could study economics, government, sociology, anthropology. And at that time, political science didn't even exist in the Icelandic language. So I decided to go to this university. I had never been abroad before. And then in my 20s, the years in Manchester and ultimately my PhD studies, opened up to me the world of English politics, and it was a time when Britain was still an empire, was the final stages of the British Empire, where the Cold War was started to dominate to the world politics. But at that time, Britain was perhaps the most advanced public debating place in the world. with extraordinary daily newspapers, enormous coverage of multiple areas, and then also this extraordinary cultural melting pot, which was not just the appearance of the Beatles, but the appearance of a new era in English theater with Peter Brooks and others, extraordinary renovation of Shakespeare and other plays, in addition to the music. And those years in the 60s I spent in England, of course the university was the base, but I learned from this grandiose performance of British society in culture, politics, science, history. And although I studied in Manchester, I went number of times during the year to London just to attend the theater, concerts, look at the museums, the art museums, the other museums, and explore the groundbreaking cultural scene which was appearing in Britain at that time. And I think it's very difficult now in the third decade of the 21st century to imagine what kind of explosion the cultural political scene in Britain was during the 1960s, where Britain was no longer an empire, but its role was changing from the old Victorian times to a cultural revolution that influenced the entire world. When I first came there, girls stayed in different residences than the boys. And if they wanted to go out in the evening, they had to have a written permission from those who controlled it. That was the old Britain of the Victorian era. When I left, all these taboos were over. So one of the lessons I got from studying in Britain is, in order to create progress, you have to break taboos. You have to be willing to embrace revolutionary things. You have to keep your mind open. You have to have the courage to go into a new territory, even if everybody is criticizing you as you go along. And when I came back to Iceland, after having finished my PhD, I brought that spirit with me. And it took me a number of years to realize that Icelandic society was not perhaps ready for the openness and the frankness and the hard-headed analysis that I had been accustomed to in Britain. Because in Britain you could oppose anybody and their views, and it was nothing personal. In Iceland, everything was personal.
Who, apart from him, could have transformed himself from the leader of a small, old-fashioned, left-wing, a bit obscure party, and suddenly becoming the unifying leader of a whole nation, as he managed during our darkest hours in the banking collapse, where he sort of understood and could encapsulate the psyche and the feelings of the nations, and despite being controversial, became a national hero.
I always said that I'm very impressed by Ólafur, that he speaks without any manuscript, and that he can go lengthy about an issue and talk very wise and to address issues to the core. That's an ability which I admire much.
When you listen to him speak, you can also understand that he has a distinct speaking style. He speaks in staccato sentences, quite often with long silences in between. This sometimes mesmerizes and always captivates the crowd. They stand and think, my God, what is he going to say next? Or is he just going to stand there in silence? Few people realize that this is because as a young kid, he suffered from being a stutterer. He even had problems in talking. And he himself, in a recent book, says that he has never really conquered this impediment. Well, he comes from Dýrafjörður, just like me. And the old guys in Dýrafjörður, they tell a story about how he managed to control this speech impediment. And it almost comes out of the old book of Demosthenes in ancient Greek. When there was a gale, the kid went down to the beach and screamed into the storm.
The heritage I got from Ísafjörður and my father was you have to reform society. That the obligation, if you are elected to office, is you have to change things sort of for the better. So the spirit of working for change, reforms, even breaking old customs in order to introduce a better world, not in a violent revolutionary way. I never believed in those kind of views.
There's a dichotomy here because it's a parliament that started in 900 AD, so it's been around a long time, but it's really only been a republic that we would understand it since the 40s. So it has the virtue of being both old and new in many ways. And the people care for each other. Its leaders are thoughtful.
Icelandic people are civil. Even though the parties are split, they have different parties and stuff, they have different approaches, but the discourse here is very civil. And I think people here, politics are not looked upon as win-lose. Yes, some people win, but then some people will say, well, okay, maybe I'll get there next time. It's sort of always forward-looking. So civility is a big thing.
Life here for Icelanders is made better by leaders like Ólafur, who gave the country some purpose beyond the shores of Iceland. He's been involved in War and Peace. He's friends with Chinese leaders, with Japanese leaders. They all think of him as both a peer and someone they can talk to, respect, and admire.
Gradually, the heritage from Þingeyri and Ísafjörður made me think maybe it's also possible to play a role, not just in Iceland, but also in other countries, because these issues at that time, the Cold War, nuclear disarmament, the issue of peace, prosperity, equality, the rise of nations and communities in Asia and Africa, became a part of the influence that gradually during my adult political life made me realize that I should not just try to influence events here in Iceland, but perhaps also in other countries. When I was elected to Parliament in the late 1970s and served there into the 80s, I became a member of the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly. There I started to cooperate with members of parliament from Germany, France, Britain, Spain, Portugal, Italy, as well as the Nordic countries. And I was giving a leadership role in organizing the first European conference on the relations between Europe and the South, meaning the underdeveloped countries. And from there, I started working with an international parliamentary organization with headquarters in New York, which had many American senators and congressmen as members. And we became very active during the height of the Cold War and brought together what was called the Six Nations Peace Initiative with prime ministers and presidents from 6 countries, including Rajiv Gandhi of India, Olof Palme of Sweden, and others. So for about a period of 10-15 years, I worked closely with political leaders from Europe and also from the United States, from Africa, Asia, as well as Latin America, both Mexico and Argentina.
Ólafur and I, as friends, go back to the early 1980s. We traveled together to certain parts of the world for the PGA, the Parliamentarians for Global Action. He was the president of it from 84 to 90 or 91, something like that. And so we were all working on the nuclear test ban treaty. That's what we were doing. And he was He was our ringleader. He was the person who held us together. He was one of the founders of PGA, and he just had this goal and this vision that we could actually get this done, that we could be instrumental in getting the nuclear powers to sign a binding treaty halting nuclear tests.
This operation, both through the Council of Europe and through the Parliamentarians for Global Action and the cooperation with the American leadership, also academic leadership, and many of the people who had worked for the Kennedy administration before, I have sometimes said was my second university education. It gave me a sense and a practice that yes, you can operate in Icelandic politics, sure, and you can have an impact there. But you can also operate on the global stage and have a big impact there. And that gave me a sense of confidence that if you have ideas that interest other people, you can basically try to operate and create networks of cooperation anywhere in the world.
He's had a great foresight, very strong strategic instinct and insight into knowing that India is going to be a world power. Its economy hadn't taken off, mind you, in the mid to early 80s. But he knew that this is a country to watch out for, and he built these very, very close ties. So he's very well respected in India, being one of the first prominent leaders from the West to be very outspoken about India's potential. When much of the West didn't see India as an ally, and they saw Pakistan as an ally, he was one of India's very early friends who believed in India, I would say, in many ways before India believed in herself. And I think that he, in some ways, I see that even about Iceland. I think that he believed in Iceland's potential, perhaps before Iceland believed in itself.
I have always seen it as a great advantage being from Iceland. But I also learned, especially early on, that if I talked a lot about what I was doing internationally in Iceland, people thought I was simply bragging. I was simply trying to enlarge myself. So gradually, I didn't really discuss these things very much here, because for a long time, people had no way of really understanding what it was all about. But that also gave me an additional freedom to actually operate internationally in a much more open way.
It's fun to discuss with him. I mean, we don't always agree on all things, and it's interesting after all these years how focused he is on issues abroad, but also at the same time it's very interesting to discuss, domestic Icelandic politics with him as well, with all his experience.
I remember when I became foreign minister, he said to me, "Össur, in your speeches, never talk as you are the foreign minister from a tiny nation. Always speak with the confidence of a foreign minister that is speaking for 100 million people." And I always did.
He's from Iceland, but he talk about the world, the future. So this really encouraging the business leaders like me. When we do anything, we should standing on the human wealth, not just one company, not just one country. We should look into the human beings' benefits in long term.
I think it is back in the year 2006 that our two countries signed a agreement, and we set up a joint cooperation project that is called SINOPAC, Green Energy Development Cooperation. And that cooperation project, actually initiated by President Grímsson, was instrumental in helping 60 or 70 cities across China to change their original coal-fired heating into the geothermal-based heating, and that helped China to have a more greener way of development.
I fundamentally believe that we can change the future of the planet by executing clean energy transformation and changes in the way our economies behave within definitely the lifetime of people who are now young, but perhaps also in the next sort of 20 and 30 years.
It's been a great pleasure, being friends and working with Ólafur on many issues, but particularly, his passion for this green transition that we're in the middle of, not only just in sharing the message of Iceland's success in making this green energy transition with really two forms of energy we have here in Iceland. Baseload energy provided for heating for homes by water, and then also electricity from hydropower. And Ólafur has been this amazing proponent for the world to understand what Iceland has to offer.
With his chairmanship of the Global Commission on the Geopolitics of Energy Transformation, perfect thing for him. We all think about energy transformation, what we have to do about getting to clean energy. But there's a lot of politics, geopolitics involved with that. And maybe scientists and stuff will think, well, we got to do this and this and this and this. But wait a minute, people have to be brought along. I can't think of a better person to head this up than Ólafur Grímsson.
My advantage from being from Iceland, with respect to leaders of other countries, was they were not on their guards because they realized neither I nor Iceland threatened them in any way. So I realized that coming from a small country, even if it was a member of NATO, but it was small, it was peaceful, far away, you could say things and suggest things that you could not do if you came from a more powerful or even a bigger country. So it gave me a freedom of expression. And I often said during those years, the problem with international politics, and one of the reasons why there is so little success in global cooperation, is that most leaders are very afraid to suggest something new. Because if they are turned down, it becomes a political problem for them back home. But I could afford to go into any meeting, anywhere in the world, and offer new ideas and new proposals and take the risk of being turned down. If I was turned down, it was okay. I just took the next plane back to Iceland and continued with my life. So gradually I found myself being in the role of the only one in the room offering new ideas, new perspectives, new proposal, because everybody else was sort of on their guard.
And I remember this very famous to us meeting in the Kremlin with Gorbachev. I think Gorbachev probably thought when he met with us that it was going to be a 5-minute meeting. Parliamentarians say hi, shake hands, get a picture. But it was more than a half an hour, maybe closer to 45 minutes or so. And Gorbachev really got engaged. And out of that meeting came the meeting between Reagan and Gorbachev in Reykjavik. And I think it had a lot to do with the fact that Ólafur was sort of our spokesperson to Gorbachev and really engaged with him in what we needed to do. I think Gorbachev liked him.
You see, when Icelanders usually go into a meeting with other leaders from other countries, they mostly emphasize what they are interested in, what the Icelanders are interested in. But I've told them that I learned during my years of working with European leaders, American leaders, Asian leaders, African leaders, and others, that the key is you have to have something to say. You have to have some ideas that are meaningful and important to those you are talking to. And if you can offer them something that interests them and it's meaningful to them, there's no limit to how far your cooperation can go. But if you go into the meeting and only talk about what interests yourself, you're not going to have any success. So, to some extent, those years working with Parliamentarians for Global Action and in the Council of Europe was a very intensive training period of how successfully to operate internationally. So when I became president, I was able to bring those lessons to the presidency and bring it into new areas of operations where my predecessors had not entered for sort of obvious reasons. And then following that, when I built up the Arctic Circle into this big international platform, without the training that I got from my cooperation with European, American, Asian, and African political leaders, it would not have been possible. There are actually surprisingly few locations in the world which serve as a meeting point for particular areas. You have Silicon Valley as a location for those with ideas for new technologies and technological progress. You have Wall Street as a location for financial dealings. You have Geneva during the end of the Cold War, maybe in the aftermath, as a location for very difficult political negotiation and sort of disarmament. But there is no such location for the combination of climate, clean energy, the future of the planet, as well as some other pressing sort of political problems. And because Iceland doesn't have any army, because our political tradition is very peaceful, we are a very open society, people feel that they can come here and start discussing with others some of these crucial problems in a way that is not possible elsewhere. And I utilized that when I built up the Arctic Circle as the location for this big global cooperation on the Arctic and the climate and the environment. Because people are willing to come here to Iceland under this umbrella and open up their minds and ideas and enter cooperation, which if the meeting took place in some of the more powerful European countries, not to mention powerful countries in Asia or the United States, people would be very much on their guard.
He is a great visionary, and I always remember when he had been a president for 2 years and gave his annual speech at the turn of the year. And he certainly gave a long, detailed speech about the Arctic and about the danger that were encroaching the Arctic. And what was remarkable about the speech, that this was in 1998, and it preceded the first report of the United Nations on the same issue by 2 years. So he really was the first guy that on the global scene took up this issue. A lot of people don't realize this. He was a visionary in the field.
He's a very good communicator and also with his very warm character to embrace everyone to be part of the community. And I think that really played off as he really made this Arctic Circle as a truly democratic and open platform for not only for the Arctic states, but for us, like us, the Asians and other non-Arctic states community as well. So I think this is just because of his leadership that the world is coming together.
Looking back at the first meetings that I had with him on the Arctic Circle Assembly, it was really just like a small crowd with big ideas. But with partnering with all these different players, really having the vision, but not only the vision, but the resilience to carry it out, has created something that is so special for all of us and so meaningful for the dialogue.
It has to be an organic process where people and partners and activists and leaders from different parts of the world decide on their own terms that this is their best option to utilize Iceland in this way. Because one of the important lessons I have learned in my public career is you have to trust people. And remarkably, most people have an inner sense of wanting to do good. And if you give them freedom to exercise this will and interact with others without necessarily giving them directives or creating boundaries, they will produce extraordinary results. That is the open democratic principle that has made Arctic Circle in very short time such a huge global international success. Because people come here from 60, 70, 80 countries, governmental representative, activists, environmental organizations, business leaders, scientists, and others, and they can do their own thing. They know there's nobody with an ulterior motive trying to control them. So I have this strong belief that if you bring people together and you allow them to interact with each other and utilize their good sense and their free will, that will make the world better. So I don't want to organize it too much, but to make it available, to offering Iceland as this location, but it's up to others to make it this place of global understanding and global interaction. So I fundamentally now believe that what I can do for the rest of my life, in the years that I will still be given, is to help Iceland to serve the world in this way, to be this place where people can come together from anywhere in the world, attempting to solve some of the most crucial problems. As more than 1,000 years ago, those who settled in Iceland came every summer to this open area of Þingvellir, this lava plateau, where they discussed in an open way the problems of this new country.
The history of Iceland is quite interesting. It's not that long ago since we were, a poor, isolated country far away. We still may be far away, but we're also not, because we're right in between North America and Europe, and now we have the Arctic opening up, so we are quite central. So I would say that we have an important role. We should use our voice. We should, take a stand on issues. For example, with everything that's happening now, sometimes you hear that here domestically, like maybe we shouldn't be, part of this. Let the bigger nations deal with this, and we should just do what we do. And I fundamentally disagree with that statement, because Iceland really has to protect the fundamental rights, both for our own citizens and also abroad. And if the bigger countries can get away with doing horrible things, Iceland does not stand a chance in that kind of world. We very much need to be able to rely on multilateralism and the rule of law and human rights. So I would say that Iceland plays an important role in that, like any other nation.
To many of the young people from other parts of the world, it kind of looks like a utopia. One of the reasons why they flock to Iceland, young people from America, Asia, and elsewhere, is here they witness that it is possible to have a better world. You only have to go back to my youth to realize Iceland was then among the poorest countries in the world, with hardly any infrastructure, hardly any modern system of communication, coal and oil being the main energy resources. And now you have this extremely well-developed, prosperous society of equality, openness, peacefulness, clean energy, where you also see the glaciers melting, but you see also the clean energy power plants. And if we can add to that, being a location for people from anywhere in the world with whatever agenda they have, to interact with others in an open and free way, to try to solve some of the most crucial problems, I think that is both a noble and a meaningful role for Iceland in the coming years and also decades.
Is an interesting ray of hope in that he ultimately did what he did, achieved what he achieved, and punched way above his weight for a country of 350,000 people, which is a tenth of my parliamentary constituency in Mumbai, to really bring sides together. And we saw that during the Cold War. We're beginning to see that in the Arctic, where keeping Russia and America united, there are non-Arctic states, near-Arctic states. It's going to take the mettle, the experience, the sort of the type of leadership that Ólafur Grímsson provides to achieve those successes in the Arctic. So my message really would be to look out for people like him, to go back to those values, because those are the values based on which democratic institutions around the world were founded. They were founded on the values that Ólafur Grímsson emanates.
We are all human beings. We inhabit this very small and delicate planet, and we have to figure out a way to do a better job of getting along. And that's not an easy task. And in our country, in the United States, our politics is broken, and people are very much divided. And I wish I had some simple answers for how we deal with that. I don't, but we have to start practicing accommodation before it's too late. Trust is really what's required. I think it has to start at community levels. Communities have to trust themselves, and they have to be able to interact with larger entities in a nation, and nations have to learn to respect and trust one another. And there's no magic formula here. It requires a lot of hard work. It requires not being judgmental about others.
We are still a society based on the principle of trusting people, assuming that anyone who comes with good intentions. Unfortunately, most other societies in the world are increasingly organizing themselves on the basis that everyone is a potential threat until proven otherwise. We are fortunately still a society based on trusting other people. And I've often told this story in other places in the world that when Reagan and Gorbachev in 1986 at their famous summit at the height of the Cold War here in Iceland, the only security provided around the building was by the Icelandic Boy Scouts and the Life Saving Society. And when Reagan left, he said, "I've never felt as secure anywhere since I became president." And as you know, that summit was one of the most historic meetings in the 20th century. And maybe it also opened up the minds of Reagan and Gorbachev, and they got some sense of the Icelandic air, not just the freshness and the purity of it, but also the air of trust. So I think simply by being what we are and hosting these meetings in the way that we host it on our terms, not necessarily adopting the international security standards that are superimposed by every secret service in the world, we can help to open up people's mind and transform the world in a better, democratic, peaceful way.
I think politics now has become so divided, and it's become so dualistic. And there was a generation of politicians, not in India or in Iceland, but around the world, in the United States as well, who had a very non-dualistic core. They understood that leadership isn't about choosing sides, but it's about bringing them together. And I think Ólafur is cut from that cloth. It's an old school style of politics where a division isn't seen as an opportunity for confrontation, but it's seen as an opportunity for reconciliation. And I think that value in politics globally is missing. That characteristic, that trait is something we need to go back to.
What I learned throughout my public career and my Icelandic and international work is you can cooperate and work with anybody. I have worked with leaders of every political party in Iceland. I have worked with leaders from America, from Russia, China, Europe, Africa, and Asia. I have honestly never found a person that I could not work with. So I think that is a very important vision to have. And it's different from this bombardment of stories about enemies, threats. Of course, there are extraordinary difficulties in terms of war and atrocities and others. But we have seen that for decades, my generation was brought up on the notion that the Soviet Union was a great evil power. And when I first went to Moscow and stood on the Red Square, I was very confused because the reality didn't fit this picture. I had been, before I arrived in the Red Square in Moscow, to Africa and Asia, and suddenly I realized Russia was a third world country, but it was cold, and it had nuclear weapons. But it was not the evil advanced economic empire. It was basically a third world country. And you can look at the Middle East. You can look at the extraordinary mistakes that have been made in the Middle East, not just in the last 10, 20 years, but also the previous 50, 60 years. And you see the difficulties, the hindrances created by this distorted view of dividing the world into camps. Of course, there is competition, there are rivalries, there are people who want to take over the world. I am not naive. I've often said to people who say, it's too simplistic a view, I said, okay, but I would never have survived in either Icelandic or international politics if I was fundamentally naive. The fact that I am still kicking at the age of 80 is, I think, a testimony to that this view that I have taken, that you can basically work with anybody, anywhere in the world, is not naive. It is perhaps the most realistic way of seeking progress in our world. You can all make a difference. That is perhaps the most fundamental lesson of my life. You can be a small boy in a tiny little village in Iceland, but when you look back on your life at the age of 80, you realize the lesson. It is possible to make a difference.
Thank you.